We make promises like all day long, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. Constantly.
Right. Like, I'll call you right back, or I'll help you move that couch this weekend.
I'll grab the check next time.
Exactly. We just throw these words out into the universe, constantly. And usually they're just social pleasantries. But then occasionally you make a promise and suddenly this invisible switch flips.
Yeah, you cross a line.
You've stepped over a hidden line in the sand, and now the entire weight of the legal system, the courts, the power of the state, it's all standing right behind those words, ready to enforce them.
It's a pretty wild concept when you really think about it.
It is. You say the right combination of words under the right circumstances, and you bind yourself to another person with, like, invisible legal chains. But what if the person you made the promise to never actually gave you anything in return? Can you just walk away?
That is the million-dollar question.
So today, for you listening, we're diving into the fundamental bedrock of contract law. We're looking at consideration.
Yes, the core of it all.
We are ripping apart the mechanics of what separates a friendly favor from a legally enforceable contract. We've got this great comprehensive legal text breaking down Chapter 3 on consideration, and our mission for this deep dive is to translate all these dense legal mechanics into simple, explanatory English.
Which is so needed, honestly, because it really is a fascinating transformation to witness conceptually. We are looking at the exact moment a mere utterance, hardens into an ironclad obligation.
And it doesn't happen by accident.
No, not at all. The law doesn't just do that casually. I mean, the courts are incredibly busy, right? Society needs a filter. We need a reliable mechanism to separate the casual noise of everyday life from serious commercial agreements.
Right.
And that filter is what the legal world calls consideration.
And understanding that filter is absolutely crucial, whether you're negotiating a salary, signing a lease, and we're going to focus really heavily on this today, if you are staring down the gauntlet of the multi-state bar examination, the MBE.
Oh, yes. The ultimate stress test.
The examiners love this stuff. They use the concept of consideration to break down legal theory and trick test takers. So we're going to use those high-yield, heavily tested scenarios to really illuminate how this works. We'll recap constantly, and by the end of this deep dive, you'll see the hidden architecture behind every deal you make.
I think framing it around those high-stakes testing scenarios is brilliant, honestly, because human intuition often directly conflicts with legal mechanics.
Oh, totally.
We tend to think of contracts in terms of fairness or morality, but at its core, consideration is simply the price that the law demands for a promise. It's the engine that makes the whole machinery of a contract run.
The price of the promise. I like that.
Right. Without it, or without a very specific modern substitute, a promise is just hot air. It just evaporates the moment you try to bring it into a courtroom.
Okay, well, let's unpack this engine. What exactly turns that friendly promise into a binding contract? Let's start with the most foundational vanilla equation.
The baseline rule.
Exactly. Before we get into the weird exceptions and the traps, we need the baseline. So my understanding from the source material is that it's fundamentally a two-part equation. You need a bargain for exchange, and you need legal value.
That is the baseline, yes. Both of those elements must be present. The bargain for exchange is, it's the action, the dynamic between the parties. And the legal value is the substance of what is actually changing hands or being promised.
Okay, so let's isolate that first element, the bargain for exchange. The concept here is mutual inducement, meaning my promise has to induce your action, and your action has to induce my promise.
Right, you're bargaining.
So let's say I offer to sell you my television for $100. And you say, I promise to pay you $100 for your television.
Let's look at the mechanics of why that works structurally. Your promise to hand over the TV is what induced or convinced me to hand over my money.
Right. You wouldn't just give me $100 for no reason.
Exactly. I wouldn't just give it away. And conversely, my promise to pay the money is what induced you to give up your TV. We are mutually inducing each other.
Got it.
So the law looks at that interplay and says, okay, a bargain has been struck. This is commerce, and we will protect it.
But where it gets tricky, and where I know the bar exam loves to set traps for you, is distinguishing this true bargain for exchange from something called a conditional gift.
Oh, this is a huge trap.
Because a conditional gift can sound an awful lot like a contract if you aren't paying close attention to the phrasing. Let's say I say to you, come over to my house and I will give you my old TV. So you walk all the way across town to my house. Isn't your walking over there the consideration?
It feels like it should be, right?
Yeah. I mean, you did something based on my words. You expended effort.
It feels like effort should count, but no, it's a crucial distinction. In that scenario, you are not bargaining for my walk. You don't care about my cardiovascular health or my exercise.
True, I just want the TV out of my house.
Right. My walking to your house isn't the price of the TV. It is simply the necessary logistical condition for me to receive a gift. You are making a gratuitous promise to give me a TV, and the only way I can physically collect it is to come get it.
Okay, let me put an analogy to this to see if I have the boundaries right. If I tell you, hey, if you walk to the fridge, I'll let you have a slice of my pizza.
A classic law school example.
Right. I'm not trying to hire you as a professional fridge walker. I don't care about your physical exertion. I'm just telling you the steps you have to take to obtain the gift I'm offering you out of the goodness of my heart.
That is the exact boundary line. You're merely stating the condition for the gift to occur. The walking doesn't induce your offer of the pizza. Therefore, there is no mutual inducement.
And no consideration.
Exactly. And because there is no mutual inducement, there's no consideration. So if I walk all the way to the fridge, open the door, reach for the pizza, and you suddenly slam it shut and say, never mind,
Which I might do.
I cannot sue you for breach of contract.
I mean, I can't even imagine the judge's face if you tried to sue me over the pizza walk.
They would laugh you out of court.
But the core lesson is vital for anyone taking an exam. We need a real bargain, not just a condition to receive a gift. The promiser has to be requesting the action as the actual price of the promise.
Right.
So that's the mutual inducement piece. Now, what about the second element, legal value? Because the text often phrases this as the promise suffering a legal detriment.
Yeah, legal detriment is one of those phrases that trips people up immediately because, well, it sounds like you have to be financially harmed or physically injured.
Yeah, the word detriment carries a lot of negative baggage in plain English.
It does. But in contract law, a legal detriment has a very sterile, mechanical definition. It simply means doing something you are not legally obligated to do or refraining from doing something you have a legal right to do.
Refraining from doing something, giving up a right. I really want to spend some time on this because it leads to one of the most famous and honestly counterintuitive concepts in legal education.
I know exactly where you're going with this.
Let's talk about forbearance. Imagine a wealthy uncle who comes to his nephew and says, if you refrain from drinking alcohol, smoking tobacco, swearing, and gambling until you turn 21 years old, I'll pay you $5,000.
Yes, the classic case.
So the nephew actually does it.
Yeah.
He gives up all those vices, he turns 21, and he asks for the money.
This scenario highlights the massive gap between how a layperson thinks and how a legal scholar thinks. A normal person looks at that uncle and nephew and says, wait a minute, giving up drinking and smoking isn't a detriment. That's fantastic for the kid.
Exactly. His lungs are healthier, his liver's better, he saved a fortune by not gambling, he received a massive physical, financial, and moral benefit.
Right.
If the definition of consideration requires a detriment, where is the detriment if his life is objectively, provably better? He literally won the lottery of good health.
But, and this is the key, the law doesn't care about his physical health, his bank account, or his moral standing.
Wait, really?
Really. The law only cares about his legal rights. As a young adult, and we are assuming the legal age in this historical scenario permitted these activities, he had a lawful right to smoke, to drink, to gamble, and to swear.
Okay, I'm tracking.
By agreeing to restrict his own lawful freedom of action, he suffered a legal detriment. He voluntarily placed a boundary around his own liberty in exchange for the promise of the money.
Wow.
That forbearance, that restriction of his own freedom, is valid consideration.
That is wild to think about, because the uncle isn't like making money off the kid not smoking. The uncle might just be getting peace of mind. He might just want to see his nephew grow up well. But emotional benefit counts.
Yes, absolutely. The subjective emotional value of the exchange is perfectly valid. If the uncle values a sober nephew at $5,000 and the nephew values his freedom to swear and smoke at $5,000, the court says, fine by us. You struck a bargain, rights were restricted, the engine of the contract is running.
Which naturally brings up a really important philosophical question about the value of things.
Right.
I mean, who decides if $5,000 is the right price for giving up smoking for a few years? What if the uncle had only offered $10? Would giving up years of freedom still be a legal detriment if the payout was basically nothing?
It would. And this is a cornerstone of capitalist free market legal systems.
Yeah.
The rule is that courts generally do not inquire into the adequacy of consideration.
Adequacy.
Right. They ask if consideration exists, not if it's fair. A bad bargain is still a legally enforceable bargain.
I feel like there's a lot of tension there, though. Shouldn't the justice system care about fairness? Like if I decide to sell my $500,000 house for $10,000 because I'm desperate for quick cash, or maybe I'm just terrible at math, shouldn't a judge step in and say, hold on, this house is worth way more, we are canceling this wildly unfair contract?
It's a natural human instinct to want the courts to protect us from ourselves. But consider the inverse. Imagine the sheer chaos, the absolute gridlock, if courts did have to judge the objective fairness of every single deal.
Oh, that would be a nightmare.
Value is entirely subjective. What is a fair price for an hour of consulting? What's a fair price for a vintage comic book or a piece of abstract art? Value depends entirely on what a buyer is willing to pay and what a seller is willing to accept at that exact specific moment in time.
Yeah, I guess if a judge had to appraise and approve the objective fairness of every single transaction before enforcing it, the entire economy would grind to a halt.
It would collapse overnight. The legal system has to respect the autonomy of adults to value things as they see fit. If you value a quick 10 grand today more than the hassle of waiting 6 months to sell your house for $500,000, the law respects your right to make that terrible financial decision. The courts are not your financial advisors.
Okay, I totally accept the judicial efficiency argument. The courts can't be pricing out garage sales. But let me push the envelope a bit. What if the consideration is a total undeniable joke? Like, what if I sell you my $500,000 house for $1 single? Because I see that in movies all the time.
The dramatic boardroom scene. Yes. I hereby sell you my shares in this company for the sum of $1. Does that actually work in real life?
That is where the law finally draws a line. We call that token or sham consideration.
Sham consideration.
Right. If the consideration is purely meaningless in the context of the deal, or if that $1 was never actually intended to be paid, you just wrote for $1 on the contract to make it look like a fancy legal document, courts will see right through the disguise.
So the court will say, this isn't a bargain. This is a disguise gift. You aren't genuinely selling a house for $1. You are giving a house away and trying to dress it up in the costume of a contract to make it legally enforceable.
Precisely. And it fails because it lacks that very first element we talked about, mutual inducement. You are not giving me your house because you desperately want my single crinkled $1 bill. The dollar isn't inducing your action. The dollar is a sham.
But wait, what if I'm a collector? What if I agree to trade my house for a very specific, rare 1804 silver dollar?
Now the dynamic shifts entirely. If you genuinely want that specific, rare coin, and I genuinely want your house, we have mutual inducement. We have a bargain for exchange.
Oh, I see.
Even if an appraiser says the coin is only worth 100 grand and the house is worth 500 grand, the court will not question the adequacy. The deal holds. But a standard paper dollar for a house, that's sham consideration, and it will not support a contract.
This is such an incredibly high-yield area to recap, especially for anyone studying the mechanics of contracts or prepping for the MBE.
Yeah.
Let's lock this in for you listening. The fundamental engine requires mutual inducement plus a legal detriment or benefit.
Exactly.
The examiners will absolutely test your ability to spot the boundary between a bargain for exchange and a conditional gift. You have to ask yourself, did the promiser ask for the action as the price of the promise?
Yes, the price is the key.
They also heavily test forbearance. Remember, the uncle and the nephew giving up a legal right, even if it makes you healthier or richer, is a valid legal detriment. And finally, adequacy doesn't matter. A terrible deal is still a valid deal, but a totally fake sham dollar will not save a disguised gift.
That is the exact analytical framework you need. Start every contract question by looking for that core equation.
Okay, so we've established that mutual inducement is an absolute requirement. The promise must induce the action, and the action must induce the promise. They have to happen in a sort of conversational dance. But that raises a massive logical problem.
The timeline issue.
Exactly. What happens if the action already happened before the promise was ever made? How can a promise induce an action that is already in the past?
It logically cannot, and that brings us to the fascinating and often tragic problem of past consideration.
It's like time travel in contract.
It really is.
The general rule is strict. Something already done before a promise is made is generally not consideration because it was not bargained for. Let's explore a really dramatic hypothetical to show how brutal this rule can be.
Let's do it.
Let's say Sherry is walking down the street, and she sees Sam standing under a construction site. A massive load of bricks falls. Sherry heroically dives, pushes Sam out of the way, and in the process of saving Sam's life, she gets severely injured. She's in the hospital, facing mountains of medical bills.
Okay.
Later on, Sam visits her. He is so overwhelmed with gratitude that he looks her in the eye and promises to pay her $1,000 a month for the rest of her life to cover her care. But a year later, Sam gets bored of paying and he just stops.
And according to the strict traditional common law, Sherry cannot sue Sam to enforce that promise. There is no legally binding contract.
I have to stop you there because my moral compass is spinning. Sherry saves Sam's life. She takes the hit. Sam promises to pay her out of pure gratitude, and Sam can just legally walk away whenever he feels like it. That is incredibly harsh.
It is incredibly harsh. It strikes most people as deeply unjust. But let's look at the cold, mechanical logic of the consideration equation. Did Sam's promise of $1,000 a month induce Sherry to jump in front of the falling bricks?
Well, no, she already did it. She reacted in the moment to an emergency. The promise came days later in the hospital.
Exactly. Because the heroic action happened first, the later promise could not possibly have induced the action. There was no bargain struck on the sidewalk before the bricks fell.
Right.
Sherry's heroic act is what the law calls past consideration. And as the old, rigid legal maxim goes, past consideration is no consideration at all.
Wow.
What Sam is actually doing in that hospital room is making a gratuitous promise to give a gift of $1,000 a month, motivated entirely by his gratitude. But as we learned with the pizza in the fridge, a promise to give a gift is not an enforceable contract.
So moral consideration isn't a real thing. The fact that he morally owes her his life and feels a profound moral duty to pay her doesn't count for anything in a courtroom.
In traditional common law, absolutely not. The law does not enforce gratitude. The law enforces bargains.
Man.
If we start enforcing promises based purely on subjective moral obligation or gratitude, the courts would be flooded. Every time someone said, "I owe you one for a favor," it could turn into a lawsuit. That clear line separating social pleasantries from legal contracts would completely dissolve.
But the law can't just leave Sherry out in the cold like that, can it? I mean, there has to be some kind of pressure release valve for situations that are this extreme.
There is, and this is where we see the law evolving and trying to fix its own harshness. The rigid rules of the common law sometimes create outcomes that make judges sick to their stomachs. So exceptions are carved out. There are circumstances where past consideration is enforceable.
Let's break those down. What is the first exception?
The first one is very technical, dealing with debts. It's a written promise to pay a debt that is barred by the statute of limitations.
Okay, how does that work?
Let's say I owe you $5,000. But the legal time limit to sue me for it, the statute of limitations, has run out. It's been 10 years. You can't sue me anymore. The debt is legally dead.
Right, I'm out of luck.
But then my conscience gets the better of me, and I write you a signed letter saying, "I know I don't legally have to pay you anymore, but I promise I will pay you that $5,000 I owe you."
Under the strict rule we just talked about, I didn't give you any new consideration for that new promise in the letter. The loan was in the past.
Right. But the law makes a pragmatic exception here. The law says, okay, the underlying moral obligation of that specific old debt is strong enough to support this new written promise. So if it is in writing, that new promise resurrects the dead debt and it becomes enforceable without any new consideration.
Okay, I can see the logic there for financial debts. But what about Sherry and Sam? Sherry saving a life isn't a resurrected financial loan.
And that brings us to the second, much more dramatic exception, the material benefit rule. This is a massive modern trend in the law, officially codified in Section 86 of the Restatement of Contracts.
So this is the modern courts pushing back against the old, cold common law. How does the material benefit rule save Sherry?
The material benefit rule says that a promise made in recognition of a benefit previously received by the promiser is binding to the extent necessary to prevent injustice.
Oh.
In plain English, if Sherry confers a massive material benefit on Sam, like saving his life in an emergency or saving his property from destruction, and Sam subsequently promises to pay her for it, the court will enforce that promise because it would be fundamentally unjust, just a failure of basic human decency and not to enforce it.
It's like the law finally grew a conscience.
It did, but it still maintains boundaries. The rule has a caveat. The promise is only enforceable as long as the value is not disproportionate to the benefit.
What does that mean in practice?
So if Sherry saves Sam from a minor scrape, a little cut on his arm, and Sam promised her $10 million in a moment of panic, the court might step in and say, whoa, that's disproportionate. We won't enforce the whole $10 million.
Right.
But $1,000 a month for saving his life and suffering a permanent injury.
Yeah.
A modern court will absolutely use the material benefit rule to enforce that.
This raises such an interesting philosophical point about how our legal system is built. You have this rigid mechanical rule, mutual inducement, that works perfectly for buying and selling TVs and cars. It's predictable.
Yes.
But when you apply that rigid rule to chaotic human emergencies, it breaks. It creates an outcome that is offensive to justice.
Yeah.
So legal thinkers had to literally invent a new rule, the material benefit rule, to act as a patch over the bug in the system.
That is exactly the history of the common law in a nutshell. It's a constant eternal tug of war between wanting predictable and mechanical rules for business certainty and wanting equitable, fair outcomes for human beings in crisis.
Let's do a quick recap on this, because if you are taking a law exam, past consideration questions appear regularly.
Oh, all the time.
The examiners will absolutely give you a scenario where someone acts heroically or does a huge favor, and the promise to pay comes after the fact.
Right.
Your baseline instinct should be no contract,
Yeah.
past acts don't count,
Right.
unless, and this is where the points are won, unless it falls into one of the exceptions. A written promise to revive an expired debt, or a material benefit conferred in an emergency that triggers the modern material benefit rule. Keep your eyes glued to the timeline of when the action happened versus when the promise was made is the whole ballgame.
Exactly. Timeline is everything.
Okay, so we've dealt with actions that happened in the past, but what if we fast forward? What about actions you are already legally required to do right now in the present?
Yes.
This brings us to the you're already supposed to do that rule, or, in formal terms, the pre-existing legal duty rule.
This is arguably one of the most practical, everyday concepts in contract law. You see this constantly if you have ever hired a contractor, dealt with a renovation, or watched two businesses renegotiate a deal midway through performance.
The general rule states that a promise to do or actual performance of something you are already legally obligated to do is not valid consideration. Let's dive into the classic scenario to see how this plays out. Let's say we have Mike, a contractor, and Richard, a homeowner.
Okay.
Mike signs a contract to build a detached two-car garage for Richard for $15,000. Everything is signed. We have a clear bargain for exchange.
Right. At this moment, Mike has a legal duty to build the garage, and Richard has a legal duty to pay $15,000 upon completion.
But let's say we are halfway through the construction. The garage is half built, there's a giant hole in the yard, tools are everywhere, it's raining, and Mike suddenly stops working. He goes to Richard and says, look, I underbid this. I need $20,000 to finish this job, or I'm walking away right now.
Typical nightmare scenario.
Richard is desperate. He needs his garage finished before winter. He doesn't have time to sue Mike and find a new contractor. So Richard agrees. He says, fine, I promise to pay you the extra $5,000.
Okay.
Mike finishes the garage perfectly. But when the time comes to pay, Richard smiles and hands over a check for exactly $15,000. Not a penny more.
And naturally, Mike is furious, and he tries to sue Richard for that extra $5,000 he promised.
So who wins that lawsuit?
Richard wins.
No.
Mike cannot enforce the promise for the extra $5,000. Why? Because of the pre-existing legal duty rule. When Mike demanded the extra money, what did he offer Richard in exchange? He offered to finish the garage.
Which he was already supposed to do.
Exactly. He was already legally obligated to finish the garage under the original contract. He suffered no new legal detriment. He didn't give Richard any new legal value. Therefore, Richard's promise to pay the extra $5,000 was completely one-sided. It lacked consideration, making it an unenforceable modification.
I actually love this rule because the underlying policy is so painfully obvious. It prevents extortion. It prevents what economists call the hold-up game.
It absolutely prevents extortion. If the law allowed Mike to do this, every single shady contractor in the world would intentionally underbid to win a job, tear your house apart, leave your plumbing exposed, and then hold your half-finished kitchen hostage until you agreed to pay them 30% more.
Oh, that makes total sense.
The pre-existing duty rule protects people from being economically squeezed when they are at their most vulnerable.
It forces people to honor their original bad deals. But, as we are learning, the law always has exceptions. There are situations where an alteration to a deal halfway through does count as valid consideration. The first exception is if there is new or different consideration, and apparently even a tiny change works.
Yes. Let's go back to Mike and Richard. If Mike says, I need an extra $5,000, but in exchange, I'll paint the garage door a custom color, which wasn't in the original contract. Or, I'll hire extra guys and finish the garage a week earlier than promised.
Oh.
Even a relatively small addition like that is new consideration. It breaks the pre-existing duty. Mike is now doing something he wasn't legally obligated to do. Therefore, Richard's promise to pay the extra money becomes totally binding.
So just by throwing in a fresh coat of paint, Mike secures the extra $5,000. What about a change in the medium of payment?
That means changing how the obligation is fulfilled. Let's say Richard owes Mike $15,000, but Richard is short on cash. Richard says, I'll give you $10,000 cash plus my old used motorcycle.
Okay.
If Mike agrees to that, the pre-existing duty rule doesn't block it. Why? Because Richard wasn't legally obligated to hand over a motorcycle. The medium of payment has changed. The law doesn't weigh whether the motorcycle is actually worth $5,000. It just sees a new, different type of detriment, which is valid consideration.
Okay, another exception is the honest dispute about the scope of the duty. If Mike and Richard genuinely, legitimately disagree about whether the original contract included paving the driveway leading up to the garage, and they argue about it but finally reach a compromise to pay an extra $1,000 to just get it done, that compromise is binding.
Yes, because giving up your right to fight a legitimate, good-faith legal dispute in court is, in itself, a legal detriment. It's valid consideration. They are buying peace.
But here's the exception that is notoriously tricky and heavily tested. Unforeseen circumstances. This feels like a gray area.
It is massive, and it requires careful analysis. Let's alter the Mike and Richard story again. Mike starts digging the foundation for the garage, and he hits solid, unexpected bedrock.
Oh, no.
Neither of them knew it was there. The geological survey didn't show it. The neighbors didn't have it. To blast through that bedrock is going to cost Mike an extra $10,000 in dynamite, permits, and specialized labor. It's a nightmare.
So Mike goes to Richard and says, look, I literally cannot do this for $15,000. It's going to bankrupt me. I need $25,000 to cover this bedrock. And Richard, seeing the massive rock in his yard, agrees.
Under the strict old, hundreds of years old common law, Richard's promise to pay the extra $10,000 is still unenforceable because Mike technically still has a pre-existing duty to build a garage on that spot.
But that feels so wrong. I mean, it's not extortion. It's a genuine disaster. Mike isn't playing the hold-up game. He's just trying not to go bankrupt over a freak geological anomaly.
Which is exactly why the modern view, and the view you must apply on the bar exam, allows a modification if it is fair and equitable in view of unanticipated circumstances. Hitting truly unexpected bedrock is the classic law school example.
Right.
The court says, this isn't the hold-up game. This is a legitimate, unforeseeable surprise that completely changes the fundamental nature of the performance. Therefore, the modification to pay more is binding, even without new consideration.
But there has to be a line here, right? Because contractors run into problems all the time. The rule can't just be, if the job gets hard, you can charge more.
You're exactly right. Mere difficulty is not enough. If the price of lumber suddenly spikes 20% due to inflation, or Mike's workers go on strike, or it rains for a week and delays him, those are normal, foreseeable risks of doing business. That is mere difficulty.
So what happened then?
The pre-existing duty rule will still fiercely apply, and any promise to pay more won't be enforced unless the difficulty rises to the level of true, unforeseeable impracticability. The bedrock is a freak event. Normal business fluctuations are not.
Okay, so everything we just talked about, Mike and Richard, the garage, the bedrock, the paint, that is all governed by the common law, which applies to services and real estate. But this brings us to a massive divergence in contract law. What happens if the contract isn't for building a garage, but for the sale of goods?
This is where the landscape completely shifts. For the sale of goods buying TVs, cars, lumber, thousands of gallons of ice cream, we don't use the common law. We use the Uniform Commercial Code, specifically Article 2 of the UCC.
And the UCC handles pre-existing duty very differently. It basically says, for sale of goods contracts, a modification is enforceable without new consideration.
This is a fundamental radical shift. To understand why it exists, think about the history. The common law, with all its rigid rules about consideration and pre-existing duty, was designed centuries ago by agrarian societies and English lords haggling over land and long-term services.
Things move slower.
But the modern business world moves at lightning speed. Merchants buy and sell massive quantities of goods rapidly. Global prices fluctuate wildly by the minute.
I imagine good faith is the key here. Let's say I'm a merchant, and I have a contract to buy 100,000 microchips for $1 each. Suddenly, a global supply chain collapses, a factory burns down overseas, and it costs the manufacturer $1.20 just to make them. They are losing money on every chip. They need to be able to call me and say, hey, I need to raise the price to $1.30 or my company goes bankrupt.
Exactly. And if you, the buyer, agree to pay the $1.30 because you desperately need those chips to keep your own assembly line running, the business world needs that new agreement to be legally binding immediately.
You can't be arguing over paint colors.
Exactly. You don't have time to dance around inventing new consideration like throwing in a free paint job or changing the medium of payment. You just need to adjust the price and keep the global economy moving.
So the UCC just completely throws out the pre-existing duty rule to save the economy.
It throws out the mechanical requirement for new consideration, but it replaces it with a different, more nuanced requirement: good faith. Under the UCC, you can modify a contract for the sale of goods without any new consideration, as long as the modification is made in good faith.
And I'd assume the UCC requires me to prove I'm facing a legitimate crisis, like a supply chain collapse, before I can force a price hike. I can't just wake up and demand 20% more to pad my profits away.
Precisely. The manufacturer facing a global crisis and losing money is acting in good faith. They have a real, verifiable commercial problem. But if the manufacturer just wakes up one day, looks at the market, realizes they are the only supplier in town, and says, you know what, I have this buyer over a barrel, I'm going to threaten to halt shipments unless they pay me 20% more.
That's the holdup game again.
That is extortion.
Yeah.
That is bad faith. And under the UCC, that modification will not be enforced, even if the desperate buyer agrees to it in the moment.
So the UCC is flexible, but it still polices against the holdup game. It just uses a standard of commercial good faith instead of rigid, ancient rule about legal detriment. Let me recap this pre-existing duty section because, for you listening, spotting the difference between common law and the UCC is the key to mastering this.
That's crucial.
If you see a contract being modified midway through, your brain needs to immediately split into two paths. Path A. Is this a contract for services or real estate? Building a house, hiring a painter. If yes, you are in common law land. You desperately need new consideration or a truly unforeseen freak circumstance like bedrock to make the modification binding.
Right.
Path B. Is this a contract for the sale of goods? Buying 10,000 widgets. If yes, you are in UCC land. You do not need new consideration. You just need a legitimate, good faith commercial reason for the change.
That is the perfect mental flowchart. Goods versus services dictates the entire rule set.
Let's touch on one last highly practical subpoint before we move on. Existing debts.
Yeah.
Because paying less than the full undisputed amount does not discharge a debt. This feels like it traps people all the time.
Oh, it traps people constantly in the real world.
Hmm.
Let's say you owe your credit card company exactly $10,000. There is no dispute about the amount. You spent the money.
Okay.
You call them up and say, look, I'm struggling. I'll write you a check right now for $7,000 if you agree to wipe out the whole debt and close the account. And the exhausted agent on the phone says, okay, agreed. Send the $7,000.
Great. Debt settled. I saved $3,000.
Not legally. Under the pre-existing duty rule, you already had a legal obligation to pay the full $10,000. Paying $7,000 is just doing a part of what you were already legally bound to do.
Oh, no.
Therefore, you haven't given the credit card company any new consideration for their promise to forgive the remaining $3,000. They can take your $7,000 check, cash it, and then turn around and sue you for the remaining $3,000 the very next day.
Ouch. That is brutal. So the verbal agreement on the phone is completely worthless. But wait, what if I offer them $7,000 and, like, my old motorcycle?
Now you are changing the medium of payment. You are doing something you are not legally obligated to do, handing over a vehicle. That provides the new consideration necessary to make their promise to forgive the rest of the debt binding. It's all about finding that new legal detriment.
Okay, let's shift gears. We've seen how a promise might lack consideration because the action already happened in the past, or because you were already legally required to do it. Now let's look at promises that fail because they aren't actually promises at all. They're empty suits. The legal concept here revolves around illusory promises and mutuality of obligation.
The general rule here is elegantly simple. Both sides must actually be bound, or neither is bound. If one party has a totally free, unrestricted way to walk away from the deal without any consequences whatsoever, then they haven't actually suffered a legal detriment.
They haven't given anything up.
Right. And if they aren't bound, the other side isn't bound either, and the whole contract collapses like a house of cards.
Let's look at a classic example of an illusory promise. Acme will buy as much ice cream as it wishes to order.
Let's say I'm an ice cream manufacturer and you are Acme Grocery Stores. We sign a big, fancy 50-page document that says, Expert Ice Cream agrees to supply Acme, and Acme agrees to buy as much ice cream as it wishes to order at $5 a gallon.
Sounds like a standard corporate supply deal.
It looks like one, but look closely at Acme's actual commitment. What have they promised to do? They promised to buy as much as they wish. How much might they wish to buy tomorrow?
Well, they might wish to buy 0 gallons.
Exactly. They have retained 100% complete, unbridled discretion over whether to buy anything at all. They haven't restricted their future freedom of action in any meaningful way.
Ah, I see.
They have suffered no legal detriment. Their promise is an illusion. It's a mirage. Therefore, because Acme is not truly bound, I am not bound either. I can refuse to sell them ice cream when they finally do order some, and they can't sue me because we never had a valid contract in the first place.
Okay, but what if Acme says, I will buy all the ice cream I need for my shop from you? Is that different from as much as I wish? Because honestly, it sounds almost identical. My needs could be 0 if I decide to stop selling ice cream.
It sounds identical, but it is vastly different in the eyes of the law, and this is a massive area for commercial law. What you just described is called a requirements contract, and the inverse is an output contract, where a buyer agrees to buy all the ice cream a specific factory produces.
So why are these valid? If Acme agrees to buy all the ice cream it needs, but then pivots to selling only hot dogs, its need for ice cream drops to 0. Isn't that just as illusory as much as I wish?
It feels like a loophole, but here is why courts step in to save these contracts. Requirements and output contracts are incredibly useful, almost vital in the business world. They provide a guaranteed supply for a buyer and a guaranteed customer for a seller, allowing both businesses to plan their operations and secure financing. Courts desperately want to enforce these deals because they provide macroeconomic stability.
So how do they mathematically get around the mutuality problem if the quantity isn't fixed?
By reading an invisible requirement of good faith into the contract. The UCC explicitly validates these. The law says, yes, your needs might fluctuate wildly due to market conditions. They might even drop to 0, but you must operate your business in good faith.
Okay, so you can't game the system.
Right. You can't just artificially drop your needs to 0 because you found a cheaper supplier down the street and want to buy from them instead. If you do that, you are breaching the contract. Because you are bound by that standard of good faith, you have restricted your freedom. You are suffering a legal detriment, and the contract is not illusory.
I see. The law imposes an invisible boundary on your discretion. It says you can change your needs, but you can't be a liar about it. Speaking of boundaries, what about the right to cancel? Let's say I sign a contract to lease a piece of equipment, but I put a clause in it that says I can cancel this contract at any time for any reason.
If you can cancel at any time, instantly, without consequence, your promise is illusory. You aren't really committed to loosing it for a year if you can walk away on day 2.
But what if I add a tiny hurdle? What if the contract says I can cancel this contract, but I have to give you 60 days written notice?
Suddenly, everything changes. You are bound. You are bound for at least those 60 days. You have restricted your legal freedom to walk away instantly. That 60-day restriction, even if it's brief, is a legal detriment, which constitutes consideration, which makes the entire year-long lease binding.
I love the cleverness of the law here. If I say I can cancel whenever I feel like it, that's an illusion, no contract. But if I add a tiny speed bump like 60 days notice, or even just 10 days notice, suddenly it's a real binding contract. The law just needs to see some restriction on your freedom to satisfy the equation.
It really does. Courts generally want to save contracts. People don't hire lawyers, draft documents, sign them, and shake hands intending to make meaningless illusions. They intend to do business. So courts will bend over backwards looking for any reasonable limitation on discretion to find mutuality and save the deal.
There is one more fascinating way courts save these deals: exclusivity agreements. I want to talk about Judge Cardozo and the concept of best efforts.
Ah, yes. Wood versus Lucy, Lady Duff Gordon. A legendary case. Imagine you are a famous fashion designer and you sign an exclusivity agreement with me. You give me the exclusive right to place your brand name on clothing sold worldwide, and we split the profits.
Okay, great. We signed the deal. Go sell my brand.
But the contract we signed doesn't actually state that I have to sell a specific number of dresses. It just says I'm the exclusive agent. So what if I take the exclusive rights, go home, watch TV for a year, and never sell a single dress? Have I breached the contract?
Well, if you didn't explicitly promise to sell any specific amount, maybe your promise was illusory. You didn't commit to anything, and therefore the whole exclusivity agreement is void, and I should be free to go sell my dresses myself.
That is exactly what the famous designer argued. She said the agent didn't bind himself to do anything, so there was no mutuality, no consideration, no contract. But Judge Cardozo stepped in and said, no, we aren't going to let this deal fall apart. In an exclusive agreement, the law will imply a promise that the agent will use their best efforts or reasonable efforts to sell the product.
So the judge literally read invisible words into the contract to save it from being an illusion.
Exactly. Cardozo said the whole deal makes no sense unless there's an implied promise to actually try. My implied promise to use my best efforts acts as my legal detriment, satisfying the mutuality requirement and making the exclusivity agreement a valid, binding contract.
Let's lock this in for anyone listening who's keeping track of these commercial traps. Empty promises fail for lack of consideration because of a lack of mutuality. If one side isn't bound, neither side is bound. But be incredibly careful because the law tries to save these deals. Requirements and output contracts. Valid, saved by the invisible boundary of good faith, contracts with the right to cancel. Valid, as long as there is some restriction, like a notice period. Exclusivity agreements. Valid, saved by the implied promise of best efforts. Spotting the difference between a true illusion like as much as I wish and a valid commercial arrangement that has implied boundaries is crucial.
The overarching theme here is that the law wants to facilitate commerce, not destroy it with technicalities, as long as there is genuine intent to be bound.
All right, we are moving into the final major conceptual area. And this is where things get really dramatic. This is the ultimate safety net. The doctrine of promissory estoppel.
This is where we leave the rigid world of mechanics and enter the realm of pure equity.
We've spent this entire deep dive strictly requiring a bargain for exchange. No mutual inducement, no legal detriment, no contract. We watched Sherry save Sam's life and get absolutely nothing because her action was in the past. But what happens if someone makes a promise? There's absolutely no consideration, no bargain at all. But the other person relies on that promise anyway to their absolute financial ruin. Can the law just stand by and watch someone get destroyed over a technicality?
Generally, the strict common law would let it happen. It would say you should have gotten consideration. But when rigid common law rules create severe, undeniable, stomach-turning injustice, a different branch of law steps in. Equity.
Equity. So this isn't strictly about enforcing a contract anymore. It's about fundamental fairness.
Right. Promissory estoppel is an equitable doctrine. The word estoppel comes from the Old French word to stop or plug. It's the law's way of stepping in and saying to the person who made the promise, okay, technically there is no contract here. Technically, you didn't receive any legal detriment or consideration. But you made a clear promise, you knew the other person was going to rely on it, they did rely on it, and it would be fundamentally unfair to let you break that promise now. We are going to stop you from walking away.
Let's look at the elements of this safety net, because it's not just a free-for-all for anyone who believes a promise. First, the promiser should reasonably expect the promise to induce action or forbearance. So I have to know you're going to rely on it.
Yes. The reliance has to be reasonable and foreseeable. If I casually mention at a noisy cocktail party that I might buy you a car someday if I strike it rich, and you run out the next morning and sign a non-refundable lease on a $300,000 Ferrari, I couldn't have reasonably expected you to do that based on a casual remark. That's unreasonable reliance, and promissory estoppel won't save you. Second element. The promisee does in fact rely on the promise to their detriment. Actual detrimental reliance. Let's use a classic scenario to illustrate this. The university plaque example. Let's say a wealthy, boastful alumni promises a university $1 million to build a new library wing. Is there a consideration?
Generally, no. A promise to make a charitable donation is just a promise to give a gift. The university isn't doing anything to induce the gift. There is no bargain for exchange.
But based on that solemn promise, the university goes out and hires an architect, they break ground, they put up a massive bronze plaque with the alumni's name on it, they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars preparing the site. And then the alumni's stock portfolio dips, and he says, you know what, I changed my mind. I'm not giving you the money. Under strict contract law, the university loses. No consideration, no contract. But under promissory estoppel, the university wins. The alumni made a clear, definitive promise. He should have reasonably expected the university to start building. That's exactly what you do when someone promises $1 million for a building. The university actually relied on it by hiring architects and breaking ground, suffering a massive financial detriment.
So the court will force the alumni to pay up.
Exactly. The donor is stopped from revoking the promise because of the injustice that would result.
Let's look at another scenario because it introduces a really profound twist on how courts fix these messes. The remedy isn't always what you think it is. Let's say Tom promises his niece, Betty, $15,000 to buy a car so she can commute to college. Is this a bargain for exchange?
It's likely a conditional gift. He's not bargaining for her to have a car. He doesn't benefit from her commute. He's saying, if you go get a car, I'll give you the money to pay for it.
Right, so Betty goes out fully relying on Uncle Tom's promise, and she shops for a car. But she's thrifty, she finds a good deal, and she only spends $13,000. She signs the loan. Then Tom gets mad at her for something unrelated and refuses to pay anything. Betty sues him under promissory estoppel. Tom reasonably expected her to buy a car. She did buy a car. She suffered a detriment of $13,000. She wins liability, right?
She wins liability. But the crucial question is, what exactly does she win in dollars? The rule states that the court may award expectation damages, or it may limit relief to reliance damages as justice requires.
Let's unpack that philosophy.
Yeah.
What is the difference between expectation damages and reliance damages in this context?
Expectation damages would give Betty exactly what she expected to get from the promise, the full $15,000 that Tom told her she would receive. But think about the math and the fairness there. If she only spent $13,000 out of pocket and the court gives her the full $15,000, she just made a $2,000 pure profit off a broken promise.
But wait, if Tom explicitly promised $15,000, shouldn't she get the full $15,000 promised? It's the principle of the thing. He broke his word.
This is where the philosophy of equity is so distinct from strict contract law. If this were a true bargain for contract, yes, she would get the full expectation of the bargain. But the whole purpose of promissory estoppel is merely to prevent injustice and reverse the specific detriment she suffered. It is not a real contract, so she doesn't necessarily get the full benefit of the windfall. The court's goal is simply to make Betty whole. By awarding her reliance damages, which is just the $13,000 she actually spent out of pocket, the court puts Betty back exactly where she was before Tom made his false promise. She is made completely whole, she isn't in debt, but she doesn't get a profit.
That is fascinating. The judge has the equitable discretion to look at the situation and say, justice only requires me to cover your actual losses, not hand you a bonus. That phrase, as justice requires, gives judges tremendous power to tailor the financial remedy to the exact harm suffered.
Yes. It prevents promissory estoppel from being used offensively to extract wealth. It is purely a defensive shield against ruin.
If you are tracking this for high-stakes exams, promissory estoppel is heavily tested precisely because it sits outside the normal rules. It is the ultimate substitute for consideration. When you see a scenario where consideration clearly fails, maybe it's a gift, a charitable pledge, or a family promise, but someone spends serious money relying on it, your radar should ping. Spot the elements: a clear promise, reasonable expectation of reliance, and actual detrimental reliance, and do not get tricked on the remedy. If the question asks what Betty can recover, look very carefully for the answer that limits her to her actual out-of-pocket reliance damages rather than the full promised amount.
That distinction between expectation and reliance damages in an estoppel context is one of the most elegant traps in contract law.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've gone from the mechanics of bargain for exchanges to the time travel problem of past acts, from the extortion of pre-existing duties to the mirage of illusory promises, and finally to the equitable safety net of estoppel. Rather than just reading a list of rules, let's weave this all together conceptually. What is the grand theory tying all these disparate rules together?
The grand theory is the eternal struggle between predictability and fairness. Every rule we discuss is a different tool the legal system uses to solve the exact same problem, deciding which human interactions the state should care about. The core equation mutual inducement and legal detriment provides the predictability. It allows massive corporations to trade millions of dollars of goods with certainty. But rules like promissory estoppel, the material benefit rule for emergencies, and the UCC good faith exception, those are the law's attempt to remain human. They are the pressure release valves that prevent the cold mechanical rules from crushing people in the real world.
Consideration is the gatekeeper. It's the sorting mechanism that decides which promises are merely social noise and which promises are backed by the awesome coercive power of the state.
Exactly.
This has been an absolutely incredible journey through the hidden architecture of our agreements. We have decoded the price the law demands, and we've seen how the law bends and flexes to prevent injustice. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, mind-bending concept that perfectly illustrates the surreal power of contract law. It's tucked away in the jurisprudence under a concept called forbearance to sue.
Oh, this is a good one.
We discussed earlier that forbearance, giving up a legal right, is valid consideration. The nephew giving up his right to smoke, for example. Well, giving up the right to sue someone in the court of law is also a legal detriment. If you accidentally hit my car and I promise not to sue you if you pay me $500 right now, my promise not to sue is my consideration. We have a valid, binding settlement contract. But here's where it gets crazy. The law says that promising not to sue is valid consideration if the legal claim is valid, or, and listen closely to this, or if the claimant reasonably and in good faith believes the claim is valid, even if it turns out to be totally false. Think about the ramifications of that for a second. Let's say I threaten to sue you for something I think you did. We negotiate, and we sign a settlement agreement where you pay me off to go away. A year later, new evidence comes to light, and we discover that my legal claim against you was completely bogus from the start. It has zero merit under the law. I never actually had a valid right to sue you. You would naturally think you can get your money back, right? Because I gave up nothing. My right to sue was a phantom. It was worthless.
You would definitely think that.
But no. The law says that as long as I genuinely and in good faith believe my claim was valid when I made the deal, my forbearance is valid consideration. The contract holds. You don't get your money back. In the world of contract law, your pure subjective good faith belief in something that isn't even legally real can magically conjure a legally binding contract into existence. The power of human belief has actual enforceable legal weight.
It's incredible.
So the next time you open your mouth to make a promise, or the next time someone demands something from you, remember the invisible switch. Remember the legal chains. Keep questioning the promises around you, keep looking for the bargain for exchange, and never forget the sheer power of your own words. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.